By sunrise in 1945, somewhere near the pine country outside Weldon Mill, Georgia, a Doberman named Red paced the tar line beside the whistle post and disappeared between stacked resin barrels before the evening bell. 3 boys saw it, none of them older than 12, all of them walking home from the spur road where they'd been skipping stones in the drainage ditch, and they called out his name. But by the time they reached the barrels, he was gone. That was the first time. What they found instead was his brass name tag lying on cold concrete near the barrel stack, warm enough to hurt the skin when one of the boys touched it barehanded. The concrete under the tag was cold. The air above it was cold. The tar smell hung thick and bitter in the evening damp, but the brass itself held heat as if it had been sitting in a man's palm or pressed against a living throat for hours, and when they looked closer, crouching low with their hands on their knees, there were 2 neat paw trails leading in behind the barrels, but none coming back out, as if a door had closed on air. The mill gate chain bore fresh scrapes near the latch, shallow and bright, the kind a dog might leave trying to push through wire. But the padlock hadn't been opened. The gate hadn't moved. The dust on the chain was undisturbed except for those 4 thin lines where something metal had dragged across it. Men in Georgia still won't touch that whistle post after dark without someone standing behind them. Weldon Mill sat low in a bend where pine gave way to red clay, and the land stayed damp even in summer. It was a turpentine operation, small but steady, run by a man named Cade who trusted his workers to walk the lines before the shift bell, and again, before dark. The mill smelled like tar and heat, and in the evenings when the crews came off, the air above the boilers made the trees shimmer like water. Smoke sat low over the barrel stacks, and the sound of the whistle, a short, clean blast that rang twice a day, carried all the way to the main road. Red belonged to the Harris family, who lived a quarter-mile down the spur road in a frame house with a tin roof and a narrow porch that held the heat all night. The dog was a working animal, lean and serious, black with rust markings on his legs and muzzle, the kind that didn't bark unless there was reason. He walked with William Harris most mornings when the boy went down to help his father on the whistle crew. Red was steady. Folks around Weldon Mill, Georgia knew him by name. He'd been with the Harris family since he was a pup, and he knew the rhythm of the mill the way some dogs know the rhythm of cattle or the turn of seasons. He knew when the whistle was about to blow, and he knew when to stay out of the way of the resin carts rolling down the spur line toward the loading dock. The night he disappeared, William had stayed home with a fever. His mother kept him on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders and a tin cup of water beside him. His father, Emmett Harris, had gone to the mill alone. Red followed Emmett halfway down the road, then stopped at the bend where the tar line met the whistle post and would not go farther. Emmett called him twice, his voice flat and patient the way a man talks to an animal he trusts, but the dog sat and stared at the post like he was counting something in the air, and finally Emmett walked on without him. That was just before 5 o'clock. The evening bell rang at 6. By the time Emmett came back up the road in the last of the light, Red was already gone. William said the dog had come home once, maybe 20 minutes after Emmett left, and sat under the porch shaking so hard the boards ticked. He wouldn't come out. He wouldn't take water. And when William tried to reach under and pull him by the collar, Red snapped at him. Not hard, just a warning, teeth clicking in the dark, and kept staring toward the road. Then, while William was inside getting his mother, the dog crawled out from under the porch and walked back down the spur road toward the mill. That was the last William saw him go. The boys who found the name tag brought it to the Harris porch that same night. They were breathing hard, and the youngest one, a child named Dill whose father worked the tar kettles, wouldn't let go of the tag even when Emmett reached for it. The boy said it burned him. Not burned like fire, he said, but burned like touching something alive that shouldn't be, like putting your hand on a stove lid hours after the fire's gone cold and finding it still holds warmth in one spot. Emmett took it anyway, and held it in his palm, and it was still warm then, faintly, as if someone had been holding it close for a long time and only just set it down. The brass was clean. There was no mud on it, no dust, no resin. It looked as if it had been wiped. The next morning, Emmett and 2 other men from the mill, both of them older hands who'd worked the turpentine lines since before the war, went back to the barrel stack and found the paw trails still there, pressed clean into the dust that had settled overnight. 2 lines in. No lines out. The prints were deep and clear, the claws visible in the soft dirt, and they led straight into the narrow gap between the barrels and the wall of the storage shed. But beyond that gap, there was nothing, no sign of digging, no sign of a struggle. The whistle post stood 10 feet away, painted white up to shoulder height and streaked with tar, where hands had gripped it over the years. There was a new mark on it, low down near the base, a scrape that looked like it had been made by something metal, maybe a collar buckle dragged hard across the paint. But there was no blood, no fur, no sign that anything had fought or fallen or been taken. On the 3rd day, the night watch at the mill, a man named Pugh, who slept in the shack by the boiler and kept the fire low through the small hours, swore he heard the whistle lever move. Not the whistle itself, just the lever, a single metallic click like someone testing the weight of it, like someone standing there in the dark with one hand on the iron bar, pulling just enough to hear it shift. Pugh got up and checked the post with a lantern, barefoot and half-dressed, but there was no one there. The lever was still. The chain on the gate hung undisturbed. The ground around the post showed no new prints. Pugh didn't say anything about it until the next morning, and even then he only told Cade, the mill boss, and Cade told him not to repeat it unless he wanted to be called a fool, or worse. But word got out anyway. One of the tar kettle men heard it from Pugh's wife, and by noon the whole crew knew. By the 4th day, men at the mill were walking the line in pairs, even in full daylight, and nobody would stand near the whistle post alone. They tied rag strips to the fence posts to mark the safe line, and they told the new hires not to cross past the barrels after the evening bell. No exceptions. The older hands in Georgia told the younger ones, "You don't go near that post unless there's 2 of you, and you don't look behind you when you walk away." On the 5th morning, just before sunrise, Red crawled back under the Harris porch. William heard him first, the scrape of claws on dirt and the low, tight whine of an animal that has seen something it cannot forget. Red was shivering so hard his whole body shook, his legs stiff and his head low, and when Emmett knelt down with a lantern to look at him, the dog would not meet his eyes. He stared past Emmett, past the house, straight down the road toward the whistle post, and he would not move from that position. He would not eat. He would not drink. He would not step onto the road, not even when Emmett tried to pull him by the collar with both hands. The dog's fur was clean. His paws were clean. There was no mud, no blood, no resin, no dust. He looked exactly as he had looked 5 days before, except that he trembled without stopping, and his eyes stayed fixed on the road, as if he were watching something approach that no one else could see. At sunrise, while Emmett was inside talking to his wife about whether to take the dog to a veterinarian in town, or whether there was any point in trying, Red slipped out from under the porch and walked back down the spur road. This time, no one saw where he went. He did not come back. He was not seen again. The Weldon Mill Council met that same afternoon in the loading shed and set a dusk curfew on Mill Road. No one was to walk the spur past the whistle post after the evening bell unless they went in pairs, and no children were to go near the barrel stacks at all, day or night. No exceptions. The older hands around Weldon Mill, Georgia, began telling the younger ones that you don't turn your back on that stretch of road, not before sunrise, not after the bell, and you don't answer if you hear something behind the barrels calling a name you recognize. And if you find something warm lying on cold ground where it shouldn't be, you leave it where it is, and you walk away. In Georgia, old hands say the road still tries to count to 5 at night, and always comes up short one. The last person to see Red walk down the spur road that morning was a woman named Opal Finch, who lived in the house closest to the mill gate and kept chickens in a pen behind her kitchen. She was filling the water trough just after sunrise when she saw the dog pass her fence, moving slow and deliberate, head down, like an animal walking toward something it had been called to. She said later that she almost called out to him, but something stopped her. The way he moved, she said, like he wasn't deciding anymore, just following. She watched him reach the whistle post, pause for a moment with his head tilted as if listening, and then turn toward the barrel stacks. After that, the gap between the shed wall and the barrels swallowed him, and Opal went back inside. She told Emmett Harris about it that afternoon, and he asked her if she'd heard anything strange. A whistle, a call, the sound of the mill gate opening. She said no, just the birds, just the wind in the pine, and the faint metallic hum that sometimes rose from the tar kettles when the air was still. By mid-morning, word had spread through Weldon Mill that the dog was gone for good, and a group of men gathered at the Harris house to organize a search. There were 8 of them at first. Emmett, Cade the mill boss, Pugh the night watchman, 2 tar kettle workers named Lowell and Dutch, and 3 neighbors from the spur road. They brought lanterns, rope, a grappling hook in case they needed to drag the drainage ditch, and 2 other dogs, a hound and a cattle dog, to track Red's scent. They started at the whistle post and worked outward in a grid, marking their path with rag strips tied to the fence posts and the low branches of pine. The hound picked up Red's trail immediately and followed it straight to the barrel stacks, nose low and tail stiff. But when the dog reached the gap between the barrels and the shed wall, it stopped cold, whined once, and sat down. Emmett tried to pull it forward, but the hound planted its weight and would not move. The cattle dog did the same. Both animals sat and stared at the gap, ears back, and would not go farther no matter how hard their handlers pulled. One of the men, Dutch, who'd worked the mill longer than anyone except Cade, knelt down and looked into the gap with a lantern. He said later that there was nothing to see, just dirt, a few scattered wood chips, and the back wall of the shed, which was solid planks nailed tight with no space between. No hole, no tunnel, no way through. But the paw prints led straight in and stopped. Dutch stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers and said, quiet enough that only the men nearest him could hear, "I don't like this." Nobody argued. They moved the search outward, walking the tree line and the drainage ditch and the stretch of scrub that ran parallel to the spur road. They found nothing. No tracks. No fur. No sign that Red had gone anywhere except into that gap, and the gap led nowhere. By early afternoon, they had covered every foot of ground within a quarter mile of the whistle post, and the rag strips hung from the fence post like a second fence, white and limp in the still air. Emmett wanted to keep going, but Cade called the search off and told the men to go home. He said they'd done what they could, and if the dog turned up, someone would see him. But the way he said it made it clear he didn't believe that anymore. The older hands in Georgia told the younger ones that afternoon, "You don't check that line alone anymore. You go in pairs, and you don't stop walking until you're back on the main road." That night, Pugh was back on watch in the shack by the boiler, and just after midnight he heard it again. The whistle lever clicking once, metallic and clean, like someone testing it in the dark. He sat up on his cot and listened. The sound came again, softer this time, and then a third time, so faint he almost thought he'd imagined it. He pulled on his boots and took his lantern and walked out to the whistle post. The lever was still. The chain on the gate hung undisturbed. The ground showed no prints. But when he put his hand on the lever to check if it was loose, the metal was warm. Not hot, just warm, the way iron gets when it's been sitting in the sun, except it was past midnight and the air was cold enough to frost. Pugh pulled his hand back and stepped away from the post. He did not touch it again. He went back to the shack and sat on the cot with the lantern burning beside him, and he did not sleep the rest of that night. On the 6th day, a boy named Thomas Lyle, who delivered milk to the houses along the spur road every morning before school, found a second brass name tag lying in the dirt near the whistle post. It was identical to the first one. Same size, same engraving, same weight. The boy brought it to Emmett Harris, and Emmett held the 2 tags side by side in his palms. They were exact matches. Emmett had ordered the first tag himself from a hardware store in town 2 years before, and he knew there had only been one. Red had worn it every day since. But now there were 2, and the second one was clean and warm, just like the first had been. Emmett asked the boy where exactly he'd found it, and Thomas led him back to the spot, a patch of bare dirt about 10 feet from the post, near the edge of the road. There were no footprints around it, no paw prints, no sign that anyone had been there. The tag had simply appeared, lying flat on the ground as if someone had set it down carefully and walked away. That same afternoon, a woman named Ruth Carr, who worked in the mill office and kept the attendance ledger, found a note wedged into the corner of the gate latch. It was a scrap of paper torn from a receipt pad, folded once, with 4 words written in pencil. Check the fence line. The handwriting was Emmett Harris's. Ruth recognized it immediately. She'd seen his signature on dozens of work orders. She brought the note to Emmett, and he stared at it for a long time without speaking. Finally, he said, "I didn't write that." Ruth asked if he was sure, and he said yes. He was sure because he'd been home all morning and he hadn't been near the mill gate since the day before. But the handwriting was his. Ruth showed it to 2 other people who knew Emmett's hand, and both of them agreed. It looked like something he'd written. Emmett took the note and folded it and put it in his pocket, and he did not talk about it again. But that evening, he and 3 other men walked the fence line from the mill gate all the way to the main road, checking every post and every gap in the wire. They found nothing. By the end of the first week, the search had become a ritual. Men walked the line every morning and every evening, marking their path with rag strips and checking the same ground over and over, as if repetition alone could force the land to give up what it had taken. But the land gave nothing back. The whistle post stood silent. The barrel stack sat undisturbed. The gap between the shed wall and the barrels remained empty, and the 2 brass name tags sat on a shelf in the Harris house, side by side, both of them clean, and both of them impossible. The older hands around Weldon Mill, Georgia, began to speak in low voices about things they would not name out loud, and the younger ones learned quickly not to ask what they meant. At night, when the mill was quiet and the tar kettles had gone cold, some of the men swore they could hear a low metallic hum rising from the direction of the whistle post, as if the lever were being pulled just enough to make the iron sing without ever making the whistle blow. On the 9th day, the hound that had refused to cross the gap at the barrel stacks was found dead in its pen, curled on its side with no mark on it and no sign of struggle. The veterinarian in town said the heart had simply stopped. The cattle dog lived, but it would not go near the mill after that, and when Emmett Harris walked the spur road alone one evening to check the fence line one more time, he found a 3rd brass name tag lying in the dirt near the whistle post, warm to the touch and identical to the other 2. By the 2nd week, the search had stopped being about finding Red and had become about proving the ground could still be trusted. Men walked the fence line every morning before the shift bell and every evening after, not because they expected to find anything, but because walking it meant the land had not won yet. They moved in pairs, never alone, and they carried lanterns even in daylight. The rag strips tied to the fence posts multiplied until the wire looked like it was hung with flags, white and gray and faded blue, and the women who washed laundry for the mill families tore more strips from old sheets and aprons and handed them over without asking what they were for. Everyone knew. The grid search had become a kind of prayer, repeated until the words lost meaning, but the rhythm remained. Emmett Harris walked the line twice a day, every day, and he carried the 3 brass name tags in his pocket wrapped in a handkerchief. He did not show them to anyone after the first week. He did not talk about the note Ruth Carr had found at the gate latch, the one written in his own hand that he swore he had never written. He did not talk about the fact that the whistle lever was warm every time Pugh checked it after midnight, or that the hound had died with its eyes open, staring toward the mill. He walked the line, checked the fence, marked his path, and went home. His wife, Claudia, stopped asking him what he was looking for. His son, William, stopped coming to the porch when he heard his father's boots on the steps. The house went quiet in the way houses go quiet when grief has no body to hold and no grave to visit. On the 12th day, a man named Silas Drum, who worked the tar kettles and had been at the mill longer than anyone except Cade, found a 4th brass name tag lying on the loading dock near the resin barrels. He picked it up barehanded and dropped it immediately, shaking his fingers and swearing under his breath. The tag was hot. Not warm, but hot enough to blister skin. Silas wrapped it in his work glove and brought it to Cade's office, and Cade set it on the desk, and the 2 men stood there staring at it as if it were a living thing. After a moment, Cade reached out and touched it with one finger. It was still warm, fading slowly, the way a stove lid cools after the fire's been pulled. He asked Silas where exactly he'd found it, and Silas led him out to the loading dock and pointed to the spot, a clean patch of wood near the edge of the dock. No dust, no resin, no footprints. The tag had been lying there as if someone had set it down with care, in a place where dozens of men walked every day and no one had seen it until that morning. Cade took the tag to Emmett that afternoon and set it on the kitchen table beside the handkerchief that held the other 3. Emmett unwrapped the handkerchief and laid all 4 tags in a row. They were identical, same size, same engraving, same brass. Cade said, "This isn't possible." Emmett said nothing. He touched each tag with the tip of his finger, one by one, and then he wrapped them back up and put them in his pocket. Cade asked him what he thought was happening, and Emmett said, "I think the mill took him, and I think it's still holding him, and I don't know how to get him back." Cade did not argue. He stood there for a moment, then turned and walked out of the house, and the next morning he told the crew that no one was to go near the whistle post or the barrel stacks unless there were at least 3 men together, and no one was to work the line after the evening bell for any reason. The men agreed without question. On the 14th day, Ruth Carr found a second note wedged into the same corner of the gate latch. It was the same kind of paper, torn from the same receipt pad, folded the same way. This time it said, "He came back." The handwriting was Emmett's. Ruth brought the note to Emmett, and he stared at it for a long time, turning it over in his hands as if looking for something hidden in the crease. Finally he said, "I didn't write this either." Ruth asked if he was sure, and he said yes, he was sure, because he had not been near the mill gate in 2 days. But the handwriting was his. Ruth asked him what it meant. "He came back." And Emmett said he didn't know. Red had come back once on the 5th morning, shaking under the porch and staring at the road. But he had not come back after that. Emmett folded the note and put it in his pocket with the brass tags, and he did not speak of it again. But that night he sat on the porch with a lantern beside him and watched the spur road until sunrise. And when Claudia came out to ask him what he was waiting for, he said, "I don't know." Some of the men began to talk, in the low, careful way men talk when they are trying to name something without saying it out loud. Some said Red had enemies, wild dogs maybe, or a man with a grudge against the Harris family. Others said the land out past the thorn fence had always been strange, that cattle wouldn't graze there, and birds wouldn't nest in the pine, and that whatever took the dog had been there long before the mill was built. A few whispered that it wasn't a man at all that had called Red down to the whistle post, and it wasn't a man that left the brass tags or wrote the notes in Emmett's hand. They said it was something that could wear a voice the way a man wears a coat, and it had been calling from the gap between the barrels for longer than anyone wanted to think about. But no one said these things in daylight, and no one said them where Emmett could hear. On the 16th day, a child named Lily Marsh, who lived near the bend in the spur road, told her mother she had seen Red standing by the whistle post just before dawn. She said the dog was standing very still, facing the barrel stacks, and his tail was not moving. She said she called his name, but he did not turn around. She said she walked toward him, but before she could reach the post, he stepped into the gap between the barrels and disappeared. Her mother asked if she was sure it was Red, and Lily said yes, she was sure, because she had seen the brass tag on his collar catching the first light. Her mother told her not to talk about it again, and she told Emmett Harris what the child had said. And Emmett walked down to the whistle post that afternoon with Cade and 2 other men. They searched the gap again, pulling the barrels aside one by one and checking the dirt behind them. There was nothing, no prints, no fur, no sign that a dog or anything else had been there. But when they moved the last barrel, they found a 5th brass name tag lying in the dirt where the barrel had been, still warm to the touch. After that week, nobody in Georgia took that road alone before dawn. Not then, not now. The men at the mill began to speak of the whistle post the way sailors speak of a reef that has taken too many boats, with respect, with distance, and with the understanding that some things cannot be mapped or explained, only avoided. The rag strips on the fence posts stayed up, and new ones were added when the old ones tore, until the whole fence line looked like it was dressed for mourning. Parents told their children not to go near the barrel stacks, not to answer if they heard a dog bark from the direction of the whistle post, and not to pick up anything they found lying on the ground near the mill, no matter how ordinary it looked. The older hands in Georgia told the younger ones, "You don't walk that line unless there's 3 of you, and you don't stop moving until you're back on the main road, and you don't look behind you no matter what you hear." Emmett Harris kept the 5 brass tags in a wooden box on a shelf in the barn, and he did not open the box again. The 2 notes written in his own hand, he folded and placed in the box with the tags, and he locked the box with a padlock and put the key in a drawer in the kitchen. Claudia asked him once what he was keeping in the box, and he said, "Proof." She asked proof of what, and he said, "That something was here and I couldn't stop it." She did not ask again, and on some nights when the wind was still and the air was cold, Emmett would sit on the porch and listen to the faint metallic hum that rose from the direction of the mill, as if the whistle lever were being pulled just enough to make the iron sing, over and over, without ever making the whistle blow. The weeks became months and the months became years, but the rules around Weldon Mill never changed. No one walked the spur road alone before dawn. No one stood near the whistle post without at least 2 others present. No children played near the barrel stacks, and the gap between the barrels and the shed wall was boarded up with new planks that were nailed tight and painted over, as if sealing it could make what had happened there less real. The rag strips stayed on the fence posts, bleached white by sun and rain, and when they tore, new ones were tied in their place. The men who worked the mill learned the rules on their first day, passed down from the older hands who had been there in 1945, and remembered what it was like to search the same ground over and over and find nothing but warm brass and impossible handwriting. The rules were not written down. They were spoken in low voices over the tar kettles and the loading dock, and no one questioned them. To question the rules was to suggest they were not necessary, and no one in Weldon Mill, Georgia, wanted to test whether that was true. Emmett Harris stopped walking the fence line after the first year. His hair went gray in the span of a few months, and his hands shook when he tried to hold a cup steady. He kept the wooden box with the 5 brass tags and the 2 notes locked in the barn, and he did not open it again, but he would not throw it away either. Claudia asked him once if he thought Red was still out there somewhere, and he said, no. She asked him what he thought had happened, and he said, I think the mill took him, and I think it's still holding him, and I think he's been trying to tell me that since the day he came back under the porch. He did not explain what he meant, and Claudia did not ask him to. William Harris grew up and left Weldon Mill the year he turned 18, and he did not come back except for funerals. He would not walk past the whistle post even in daylight, even with others. He said the place made his chest tight and his hands cold, and he did not want to know why. Years later, when his own children asked him why he never took them to see the town where he was born, he said only, "There's nothing there worth seeing," and he did not say more. In 1950, the mill changed hands. Cade sold it to a company out of Savannah, and the new owners brought in a crew to expand the operation and modernize the equipment. They tore down the old storage shed and built a new one farther from the road, and they moved the barrel stacks to the other side of the loading dock, but they left the whistle post where it was, and they left the fence line alone. And when the new foreman asked why the workers walked the line in groups of 3 and never touched the post after dark, the old hands told him, "That's just how it's done here." The foreman did not press. He had been in Georgia long enough to know that some rules exist because of reasons no one wants to say out loud, and breaking those rules is not worth the cost of finding out why they were made. He watched the way the men moved around the whistle post, stepping wide, keeping their eyes forward, never stopping, and he learned to do the same. On a cold morning in 1952, a maintenance worker named Carl Hodge, who had been hired by the new company and had never heard the story of Red or the brass tags, found a 6th tag lying on the ground near the whistle post. He picked it up and brought it to the foreman, and the foreman asked the old hands if they knew what it was. One of them, a man named Silas Drum, who had found the 4th tag back in 1945 and was now in his 60s, his hands gnarled from decades of working the tar kettles, took the tag and held it in his palm for a moment. It was warm. He wrapped it in a handkerchief without a word and walked it over to the Harris house, even though Emmett had not worked at the mill in over a year and rarely left his porch. Emmett opened the door, saw the handkerchief in Silas's hand, and said, "Another one." Silas nodded. Emmett took the tag, unwrapped it, and stared at it for a long time, his face expressionless. Then he went into the barn and unlocked the wooden box and placed the 6th tag inside with the others. He did not say anything. He locked the box, put the key back in the drawer, and went inside. Silas stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the wind in the pine, then turned and walked back to the mill. He told the foreman that the tag had been returned to its owner, and the foreman did not ask what that meant. In 1958, Emmett Harris died in his sleep. The wooden box was found in the barn after the funeral, still locked, and William Harris opened it with a crowbar because the key had been lost or hidden. Inside were 6 brass name tags, all identical, and 2 folded notes written in his father's handwriting. William read the notes, checked the fence line, and he came back. And then he closed the box and buried it in the yard behind the house, 6 feet down, in a spot he marked with a flat stone. He did not tell anyone where he had buried it, and he did not visit the spot again. The house was sold a year later, and the new owners never knew there was a box under the yard, or what it held, or why it had been buried with such care. But the whistle post stayed, and the rules stayed, and the stories stayed. Mothers in Weldon Mill, Georgia, still tell their children not to walk the spur road alone before sunrise, and not to answer if they hear a dog bark from the direction of the old barrel stacks, even though the stacks were moved decades ago and the shed was torn down and rebuilt on the other side of the property. Workers at the mill still walk the fence line in groups, and they still tie rag strips to the posts, even though most of them do not know why. The older hands still tell the younger ones, "You don't stand near that post unless there's 3 of you, and you don't look behind you when you walk away, and you don't pick up anything you find lying on the ground near the mill, no matter how ordinary it looks." And on some nights when the wind is still and the air is cold, people swear they can hear a faint metallic hum rising from the direction of the whistle post, as if something is pulling the lever just enough to make the iron sing over and over, without ever making the whistle blow. In 1973, a child walking home from school found a brass name tag lying in the dirt near the whistle post. She brought it home and showed it to her father, who recognized it immediately even though he had not been born when Red disappeared. He took the tag from his daughter's hand. It was warm, even though the ground was cold and the tag had been lying in shadow, and he walked it down to the mill and gave it to the foreman. The foreman locked it in a drawer in his office and did not speak of it again, and the child was told in the same low, careful voice that parents in Georgia have used for decades that she was not to go near the whistle post again, and she was not to talk about what she had found, and she was to remember that some things in this world do not follow the rules we know, and the only way to live with them is to respect the distance they demand. People in Weldon Mill, Georgia, still don't ask out loud what really happened that spring in 1945. They talk around it. They talk about the dog that disappeared and the brass tags that kept appearing, warm and impossible, and the notes written in a man's hand that he swore he never wrote. They talk about the hound that died with its eyes open, and the whistle lever that moved on its own, and the gap between the barrels that led nowhere, but still seemed to swallow things whole. They talk about the rules that were made and the rag strips that still hang on the fence posts, and the way the older hands teach the younger ones to walk the line in groups and never turn their backs on the fog. But they do not talk about what it means that the brass tags still appear, decades later, always warm, always in places where no one has been. They do not talk about the fact that the whistle post still hums on cold nights, or that children still see a black dog standing by the barrels just before dawn, or that the mill has learned to count to 5 and always comes up short one. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Weldon Mill, Georgia dares to say out loud? What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? And why do people there still follow rules made for a dog that disappeared 80 years ago? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.